Make America great again. How can you be against?
We are not going back.
Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined today by senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin, columnist James Hohmann, and our special guest, JM Rieger, who's a senior video journalist on our team. Welcome back, JM.
Thanks for having me.
So good to see you. We are about to send you to the wild streets of New York City to cover the vice presidential debate. So we're going to wring every bit of information out of you before you go. We're going to look ahead today to what might be the most watched moment between now and election night on November 5th, and that is Tuesday's vice presidential debate between Republican nominee for vice president, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, and the Democratic nominee for vice president, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. We'll talk about how the men are doing on the campaign trail, how voters are perceiving them, and thanks to JM, we've dug into the archives to share with you some clips of their past debate performances that you probably haven't heard before. Also, the issues that are likely to come up in the Veep debate, we'll go over those, including the issues that are dogging them that they can't seem to shake off. I did not mean to make both a Taylor Swift reference as well as a eating dogs and eating cats reference in that, but I did. Later on in Sidebar, we'll talk about a different dynamic that keeps coming up in the 2024 election, and that is gender. There's the potential for the first woman president. The issues of abortion and IVF have been front and center, and Donald Trump keeps talking about women. Then there's the brewing scandal around North Carolina gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson. And there's a significant gender gap in how voters are leaning in the presidential election, so we'll dive into that. But to start, the debate that's coming up in just 5 days. How important are vice presidential debates? I'll throw it open. Rhonda, I mean, to say that this is one of the most watched nights until the election is sort of like, wow, how is that possible?
Well, this one might be the most watched night because it might also be the last time we have a debate in this cycle, a debate on the presidential ticket. So it's important for that reason, too. I think this one may be uniquely important because if you look at polling, it still shows that voters don't know much about Vance or Walz. They know enough, probably. Many voters know enough to vote. But I think there is still a lot of interest in both of these men. A lot of the things that we have seen from both of them seem to be, the quick clips, certainly with Vance, and statements that have been made. So I think people will likely tune in for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
These are both super surrogates. No one's voting for vice president, but these are essentially the spokesperson for their ticket. And I think that there is a threshold test where, in Donald Trump's case, he's going to be older than Joe Biden at the end of his second term if he wins. You're voting for a guy who's 40 years old to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. Bob Dole was the vice presidential nominee for Republicans in 1976 and became the presidential nominee 20 years later. So you think, you might see J.D. Vance again in the future in another debate. I think people will watch not to see sort of how likable they are, but basically this is one of those, the VP plays the attack dog role. Both sides are going to be trying to sort of make the case. I think J.D. Vance making the case against Kamala Harris that Donald Trump, frankly, wasn't able to do very well at the debate himself. And I think Tim Walz more making the case for Kamala Harris, that she's someone that you can be comfortable with being president.
We'll talk more about who these two men are. But first, JM, you'll be there in person. What are you curious about? What questions are you going in with?
So we went through this week and watched all of these past debates from both Walz and Vance. There were over a dozen of combined and
of debates that they've done in the past.
They've done in the past.
And we locked you in a room. We didn't let you leave until you watched all of them.
Yes, it's like we're talking, James Corden sketch or something, right?
We're talking debates for House, debates for Senate, debates for governor, like
right,
this
right. And Walz has been on this stage since we went back to 2006, right? His first congressional race. Vance had a few in 2022 when he ran for Senate, right? There were issues that came up in those debates that definitely could come up again, right? Vance was pressed on his stance on immigration, for example. Walz, his military service came up. We expect that both could potentially go at each other in this debate on those issues, right? Walz had a very strong line in his final debate in his second gubernatorial contest in 2022, talking about women and reproductive health. This was shortly after the Dobbs decision that year. We expect this to be another kind of key issue this election, right? So it's things like that that I think the past sort of informs the present and the future and what we might expect at this debate.
Rhonda, what do voters know about these two men? How defined are they?
Well, I think people may know about their current jobs. You know, Walz is governor. You have a U.S. Senator with J.D. Vance. But I will read you guys some research I did earlier today. There was a Quinnipiac poll that just came out, and it talked about the likability for all the candidates, all four. When it comes to Tim Walz, right now people see him as 22% of people say they have not heard enough about him, which again goes to my first point that I think both of them have room to introduce themselves still, even though we're only weeks out. He is also 36% seen as an unfavorable candidate, which, again, that may be because a lot of people just don't know a lot about him. But when you look at the numbers for J.D. Vance, 17% of people said they haven't heard enough about him. So more people have heard of Vance than Walz, but perhaps maybe not for the right reasons. And 46% find J.D. Vance unfavorable. So it appears that both of these men will have to play certain roles in this debate. For J.D. Vance, I think it's the likability issue. I think a lot of voters have heard about him, but maybe in ways that the campaign may not want people to remember. We've had the cats and dogs story with Springfield, Ohio. We learned that even his team called to fact check that story, and
Before he
said it, and he went ahead and said it and said that sometimes you have to create stories to get media attention. There's the childless cat lady, that even though that happened before this election, it's still something that seems enduring with a lot of people, especially women voters. So both of these men have some work to do, but I did find it interesting that more people know of Vance, but more people find him unfavorable.
What is the favorability? Like, how are they doing in terms of people who like them?
Well, with Vance, it is 36% of people find him favorable. With Walz, it's 41%. So that's pretty close.
James?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because in some ways, Vance has had the worst VP rollout maybe since 1972 when they had to drop the Tom Eagleton from the ticket. It really is sort of stunning how he got defined. It does appear from our reporting that the Trump folks didn't really know, even though he'd said it publicly and it had been a kerfuffle about the childless cat ladies thing, that was not in their opposition research book that they had built on Vance. And I think one of the things that's really dogged Vance, I've known J.D. Vance for almost a decade now, is like he's angrier than he used to be. And some of it, this is weird to say, but like he's lost a lot of weight. And so he has like an edge to him that he didn't used to have. And I think in his sort of trying to defend Trump and trying to take the fight to the left, he just comes across as a jerk in a way that honestly he wouldn't quite come across quite as much as a jerk if he like weighed a little more, like in his old body. But now he's like svelter and he has the beard, and he comes across as angrier than he used to. And I think that's, people see that, they react to that. And I think, part of his challenge in this debate is his job really isn't to improve his own favorability. His job is to get people to vote for Donald Trump and not vote for Harris. But I do think, how much is he going to try to sort of be like, I'm actually a regular guy from Ohio versus Kamala Harris is a far left radical, that kind of thing.
I wonder, too, because this race is so static and always has been, that just even minor things may help move the needle a little bit. I do wonder if likability matters to independent voters who may be on the fence about the very top of the ticket, but say Vance says something that might resonate with an independent voter and make them maybe like him a little bit more. Would that change things? So, yeah, and being up against Walz, that might be, a little tough because he does seem to be that everyman. In fact, one of our producers, Peter, said, and I've just got to repeat this because I found it very accurate and also funny, that Walz seems like the guy that is always on the way to Home Depot. Like when people tune in and if they see the Vance that you're saying is a little angry right now against the guy who's like on the way to pick up, some tools on Saturday, that's going to be very hard for Vance to overcome that type of image.
And if I could just add to that, I do think I should say, I think expectations kind of, and that's like a nebulous thing. Whatever. I think the mainstream media, like DC Beltway, expectations for Vance are too low. I think he will exceed expectations. He actually is a brilliant person. He is a smart, quick, on his feet debater. I think Tim Walz has this kind of like goofy aw shucks, like laugh it off, dude, like, that kind of thing. But JD Vance is like, he will have zingers, and I think maybe the risk is he looks angry and like he's, but he'll be he's a good debater.
Angry or superior. Right. I think maybe that's what you're getting at too. Yeah. I'm glad that the white guy on the panel talked about another white guy losing weight. I'm not touching that, but like no judgment. But I mean, it does, like, does he seem like superior and unrelatable because he's like pounding someone, whereas if he were a little more aw shucks himself, he might seem more relatable. I'm wondering about, so Tim Walz has had this attitude of being like the joyful warrior, and that's part of exactly what he's trying to personify on the campaign trail. Has that always been his style, JM, as you've looked back at past races he's run?
One thing that stood out to me in watching all of the Walz past debates was that his style is very similar. He shifted a little when he was running for governor, and especially when he was running for a second term. But these themes of kind of portraying himself as like a moderate, portraying himself as in favor of freedom, that we talked about at the DNC about how Democrats have sort of co-opted freedom from the conservatives a little bit, right?
Took it back.
Yeah, took it back, right? On economy, on health care, right? On reproductive rights, right? And Walz definitely put himself in that corner. And the other thing is he was able to, in all of the debates that I watched, deflect these attacks from his Republican opponents on this guy's too far left, this guy's not for you, because Walz would basically frame it as like a common sense, this is logic, this is basic logic, can't you all see this? And his oratory style feeds into that. So I actually think that's going to come out at this debate on Tuesday, and that he's going to use that as kind of a tool to deflect, because I do anticipate that Vance is going to try and paint them as kind of liberal, out of touch, right? We know that the Trump campaign wants to do that. They haven't been that effective at doing that so far. And I think that's going to be a tool that Walz used. That came up again and again when I was watching his old debates. Let's
watch a clip that JM's prepared for us. It's from 2012 when Tim Walz was running for re-election in the House. And two things to listen for here are that bipartisanship. He's trying not to seem, and in the House he was a moderate Democrat, but he's trying to seem like reaching across the aisle, kind of like the everyman, but also like the real working everyman. So let's listen.
Probably one of the most successful members during this Congress were working with people. The Stock Act was a great example of this. I know it's unconscionable to believe that wasn't a law ahead of time, that I could get information from somebody telling me that 3M was going to build a new plant and then invest in stocks in that you didn't have. It is absolutely American to be skeptical of government. It is an absolutely cancerous thing to be cynical. And so I worked across the aisle. The president brought it up in his State of Union. This was a bill that had 5 co-sponsors and myself languishing for 6 years as I churned it out. And at the end of the day, when we needed a compromise, the majority leader of the Republican Party, Eric Cantor, stood on the House floor and said, I want to thank my friend Tim Walz for his bipartisan willingness to move an important bill to restore faith in the Congress. That thing is now the law of the land. And just this week, you can go online. There's a tool online. You can click on any member of Congress and can know exactly how much I owe on my Sears card, how much I'm making, and what I'm investing in, which is nothing because middle-class people earn their living.
Tim Walz in a debate running for re-election in the House back in 2012. Eric Cantor, remember that guy? Yeah.
And Sears.
And Sears. Oh, all right.
That's what I remember out of that clip.
So, JM, why did you pick that one to share with us?
So I think it's interesting for 2 reasons. One is he talks about the bipartisanship, right? And he also talks about how he's getting things done. I think a theme of the Harris campaign here is, what are you going to do for me, especially on the economy, right? And that's one thing we haven't talked on much yet, of like, it's definitely going to come up on Tuesday, right? It's the top issue for voters. And Walz there is talking about how he's pushed things across the finish line, because there's been sort of a soft focus approach, if you will, from the Harris campaign on the economy, right? But that sort of worked for her so far because the focus has turned to Trump and his kind of protectionist themes on the economy, and that's kind of where Vance is as well. And I think that if Walz is framing this, if there's a conversation between those two on Tuesday night and Walz is talking about how we're going to get things done, that should be a winning issue for Walz.
It's interesting because when you watch that clip, Walz has actually gotten better at this. I did a big profile of Tim Walz in 2010 when he was facing a really tough race. He had won unexpectedly in 2006. And that, I mean, it's righteous outrage, but the kind of like anger, and he's like coming in hot. And sort of like unnecessarily so. He doesn't do that as much. He's better at that. I mean, it's still him, but he has
a little more Minnesota nice on it now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's like a softness, the sandpaper.
He's
down.
saying tough stuff.
He does,
but
he's
it's like in a softer.
So he is right, and he is, but part of his shtick is like and it's true. I do expect this is going to come up during the debate, which is that like Vance has a lot of money from his time as like an investor working for Peter Thiel, and Tim Walz literally has like no assets. It's kind of wild. He has a pension, but he doesn't have a 401k. He doesn't own a single share of stock. And I assume he'll like lean into that during the debate to be like, we're middle class. The way you saw Kamala Harris, it's become a punchline, which I think they're actually happy with, where, when you don't want to answer a question, you say, well, as a child of a middle class family, but it got through, it punched through that like Kamala Harris grew up middle class. Tim Walz grew up middle class. Donald Trump did not.
But JD Vance, JD Vance literally came to the national consciousness by sharing about his very difficult childhood and his book Hillbilly Elegy. Why is he not perceived of as relatable by now some voters who like him, sure, but like generally he's not perceived of as like a relatable guy.
It's really interesting because so he went to Ohio State, the Ohio State University. You have an Ohioan in the house.
Are you supposed to do like a whoop or like I don't even know.
If you feel moved too, you can.
OHIO.
Good job, Jim.
He it was funny because Walz in his speech at the Democratic convention attacked Vance for going to Yale Law School. And it was funny because I looked at the program that night as he was talking, and I counted at least 7 other people who were speaking that night at the DNC who had gone to Yale Law School. But I think there's something about Vance, and maybe it's because he's of the Senate and he's of Washington, even though he hasn't even been there 2 years.
I mean, that's just like he hasn't even been here 2 years.
And it's part of the fact that he was so poorly defined. And, that like, he should have been able to introduce himself as like, I'm, and remember that powerful moment at the Republican convention where he pointed to his mom in the crowd and like their reconciliation. I mean, he has a good story to tell about being, coming up from his bootstraps.
They both have origin stories that play to this, like we're middle class, we're common sense, whatever, but Walz has done a much better job of communicating that, I think, so far than Vance.
And it probably also speaks to the fact that Vance has moved up so quickly, and there really hasn't been a lot of time to define, work with the right type of strategist to get your message out. He came to national awareness for being an anti-Trump person, very, out there, forceful about it, and then switches. So that too is something that had to be explained to Ohio voters. I remember when covering that Senate race, some people were wondering, well, how did he flip that quickly? And I think that question is still out there. So I think given that he ascended so quickly from being, this first term, and not even finishing the first term of a Senate seat and going into this role, or potentially going into the VP role, it was just really quick. So who is he? I think people still want to know.
Some of the things he's been saddled with have come out of his own mouth: childless cat ladies, the falsehood that Haitian immigrants in Ohio were eating cats and dogs and claiming people's pets. So we can assume, I think, that that'll come up, the question of immigration, the topic of immigration, which is exactly what Trump and Vance want to come up, but also just this idea of rhetoric and how you use your words. So JD Vance has talked in the past about accusations that in his desire to change immigration law and make it a lot tougher, that he's like a racist. And he's had to answer this question before. It may certainly come up, trying to tie those two things together at the debate on Tuesday night. So let's listen to JD Vance back in 2022. He's running for Ohio Senate, and he's running against, at this point, he's won the primary. He's going against Democrat Tim Ryan. And let's hear how he talks about his family and immigration.
This is disgusting.
I'd like to get
Here's exactly what happens when the media and people like Tim Ryan accuse me of engaging the great replacement theory. I'll tell you exactly what happens, Tim. What happens is that my own children, my biracial children, get attacked by scumbags online and in person because you are so desperate for political power that you'll accuse me, the father of 3 beautiful biracial babies, of engaging in racism. We are sick of it. You can believe in a border without being a racist. You can believe in the country without being a racist.
That is a clip of J.D. Vance back in 2022, and we may hear something exactly along those lines at this debate. Great replacement theory? Tell us more, James.
It's more JM's department, not that.
Feel free to toss it to JM. Take that football and toss it over.
I can do it, but
Well, this, I mean, technically harkens back to like a 1970s French novel, right? This has been on the far right.
Which is called?
Camp of the Saints.
Wow.
And
Pass the pop
this
quiz.
is the premise of the book is basically you have hordes of migrants of color overrunning white Europeans, and it's very graphic. That's the top line SparkNotes version. But it's a racist book that lives in kind of far right circles and has kind of surfaced over the last, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 years in a little more of mainstream conservatism, right? And this idea, and we've heard this again and again at Trump rallies, we heard this in 2016 of they're coming here, the immigrants are coming here and they're replacing us. They're replacing native born Americans, right? So that's what Vance is referring to there when he's trying to deflect Tim Ryan saying you're peddling great replacement theory, right? I think that clip is notable because, to your point, Libby, I think we could hear almost a verbatim line from Vance on Tuesday night, right? And it's also interesting because Vance has not talked about his family that much on the campaign trail. And that's interesting too. We were just talking about how bad his messaging has been so far in terms of defining himself, right?
And humanizing him.
And humanizing himself. And I am a little surprised because it was very a core theme of his RNC speech. I'm actually a little surprised he hasn't talked more about his origin story and more about his family on the campaign trail.
I am too. And it's weird to say, but I mean, you do kind of wonder, like, he is trying to appeal to the base. They're trying to get the Trump base out. And maybe there is a little bit of discomfort talking about it. There's something
about the fact that he's married to a woman of color, that
he has biracial children, and I mean, I think that there's like a sensitivity to it. In the last few weeks, Laura Loomer, who's really out there, but helped Trump with debate prep and was on Trump Force One for a while. She made some really racist comment about how, if Kamala Harris wins, the White House is going to smell like curry. And J.D. Vance was asked about that. He has an Indian wife. And he really declined to say that's inappropriate. He said, well, whether it's curry or fried chicken, he gave a bad answer instead of saying, no, like that's wrong. And like, it's the curry's is American, and remember one of the things Usha Vance said during her speech at the Republican convention was talking about how JD learned to cook for her family, and he learned to cook vegetarian meals. Yeah. But that's humanizing. That's heartening. That's, and so anyway, but I
haven't heard it repeated. Like
he doesn't, he's not out there. He could in a different Republican context and environment, he would be leaning so hard into that, talking about his Indian family and being married to the child of immigrants, and he doesn't do that. And I can't say why that is, but I think that there is like some sensitivity to not wanting to piss off like the core MAGA base.
Immigration will be an issue that I think both candidates may be eager to talk about, but also a little bit defensive on, because Trump has talked about mass deportations. At the RNC, we saw people holding up signs calling for mass deportations. So that's where we could see that J.D. Vance defense of like, how can we be racist? Look at me, look at my personal life. But for Tim Walz, it's also a sensitive point. Kamala Harris is heading to the border for the first time since being made the Democratic nominee. There is a realization that the economy and immigration are things she needs to beef up on and get stronger on. Rhonda, do you see opportunity in this debate for Walz to try to define more of who he and Harris are and what they want? Or are they playing offense or are they playing defense?
I would guess, because, we obviously don't have answers yet, this hasn't happened yet, that he's going to be very prepared for that area, because Democrats do know that that is an area of vulnerability. So he will likely be prepared. Walz will be prepared to talk about that. But I do see it as an area that Vance will try to go hard on. And you're right, we might see the angrier Vance when that question is raised.
Well, there's righteous anger that both candidates can certainly exhibit, and then there's just anger. So
right.
Part of it's just how it comes across, right?
Right, and it is sort of hard, even though Walz is running obviously on the Harris ticket. He doesn't have much of a track record when it comes to that issue, if you think about it, his congressional track record, or, he's a governor of a state, and it's not a border state, even though there have been issues of immigration that he's probably handled locally. So it'll be interesting to see what the moderators do in that section. I am certain it'll come up. I would be so surprised if it doesn't take up time in the debate. But we'll see. We'll see how Walz handles it.
One of the issues that has been dogging Tim Walz is his military service, which is so strange in many ways because he was a non-commissioned officer. There's a lot of pride among the enlisted ranks when people rise up, because you're not going to like West Point and going through that system. You're enlisting men and women, and you're rising up through the ranks through that. It's like seen as like a very like hardworking, well-earned thing. So what's been the confusion about his rank, and how has he talked about it so far?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is he has described himself as a command sergeant major, and he technically was a command sergeant major, but he retired before enough time had passed and he had finished enough certifications to retire as a command sergeant major. So he retired as a sergeant major, even though he had been a command sergeant major. And so some of it is like, oh, he's claiming he had a title that he didn't have.
But that seems, you just explained it so easily and
right.
succincly.
But so the other thing, I mean, more recently,
right? Rhonda and I are going to laugh, but right? But so,
yeah.
He summarized quickly. Yeah.
He said, he's said, when he's talking about like gun control, he said, I handled weapons of war, and he's made a couple comments that sounded like he had been in war when he hasn't been. He was deployed to Italy, and there's some sense, and some former guys in his unit, although not close to him, have said like he basically retired after like 24 years from the Army National Guard right before we were going to go to Iraq. And so he avoided doing this tour of duty in Iraq. And there's like a newspaper clip.
And the counterpoint of that was what?
He told the Mankato paper, like he said, like, oh, the unit's probably going to get deployed to Iraq. And, he's a teacher and he was coaching the football team, and he has 2 little kids. And so like he wanted to not go to Iraq. And so I think you are going to hear Vance say, you went out of your way to avoid going to Iraq. I went to Iraq. And, and how, and I think Walz will say, well, I was, they were both enlisted actually. They'd be our first, either would be our first vice president who served in the military, who was not an officer.
Who was enlisted. Yeah. I mean, that's
a pretty amazing thing on both sides, because Vance really did have this hardscrabble upbringing, and like the Marine Corps was his like way out of Middletown, Ohio.
It is interesting that you don't hear as much about his military record when that is something that traditionally works for a candidate. I am surprised that the campaign is not doing more with that.
Well, you're in luck, because JM Rieger, it's like he read your mind. He actually brought us a clip of J.D. Vance. This is back in 2022, and it's again from when he was running for Senate, but this time he's still in the Republican primary. So he's trying to defeat other Republicans, which was a really tough, nasty race in a lot of ways to get to become the nominee for this Senate seat. So let's listen to J.D. Vance talking about the military back in 2022.
As the only other person who served his country in uniform, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. My mamaw had 6 grandchildren, 3 of them enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. I think the way you use the U.S. Marine Corps, Josh, is disgraceful. It's not a political football for you to toss around. Think about what we just saw. This guy wants to be a U.S. Senator, and he's up here, hold me back. I got 2 tours in the Marine Corps. What a joke. Answer the question. Stop playing around.
J.D. Vance back in 2022. JM.
I think that's interesting because, again, looking toward to the past to see what might happen on Tuesday, I definitely see Vance kind of saying something similar in terms of criticizing Walz on his military service or these discrepancies in the record. I do think also when James was talking about kind of the veterans issues and the Iraq war and whatnot, these all came up when I was watching, especially the Walz debates.
For governor,
yes. And even for Congress, he talked about like some veterans affairs issues and whatnot. And I do wonder if there's a dynamic that pops up on Tuesday night where Vance has not been in there that long, and he is sort of more of a quote unquote flamethrower and Walz sort of.
Do you mean in the Senate?
In the Senate,
Yeah.
yes. And Walz has sort of positioned himself, and that's not to say Vance has not done anything, but Walz sort of has positioned his congressional record as, I worked across the aisle, and he bragged about working across the aisle. He touted it over and over again. And I do wonder if there is a dynamic on Tuesday night where they talk about basically their accomplishments in that sense. Who's actually going to get something done for the American people when they're in office, right? And how they talk about that and how they frame that issue, I actually think could be a very key dynamic.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that as well, because you have one person who has a longer career in politics. He has a congressional record as well as a record as governor, and he had a pretty active state legislature that passed a lot of things that he can point to. Yeah. You have a younger guy who doesn't have much of a political background. So I see one talking about what they've done and the other talking about what they can or will do. Exactly. And that boils down then to what the voters want to hear. Do they want someone who's going to promise what they can do without evidence, or are they going to want to hear from someone who says, in my state, I had a school lunch program that we got passed through the legislature. Prescription drugs were brought down. So that's going to be interesting too, because that is a very big difference in both of them.
It is really interesting. He's been in the Senate for not even 2 years, but he did partner with Sherrod Brown on the railroad safety legislation after that Norfolk Southern crash in East Palestine, Ohio. And I was interviewing Tim Kaine last week, and Tim Kaine was saying that he was actually negotiating with J.D. Vance about covering, requiring insurance coverage to cover birthing related expenses, and that they their talks were pretty advanced, but then they stalled once Vance was being vetted for VP. And so Kaine was joking. Kaine's running for re-election. He's going to win. Kaine was joking that next year he hopes when Vance is still in the Senate, they'll be able to revive working on that and and get a bill through. So and part of it is a reminder that Vance does have, he's tried to position himself in this populist strain of the party, where he's kind of taking on the free trade consensus, and he's even more outspoken than Trump in opposing U.S. Support for Ukraine against Russia, and that's part of this political identity he's tried to carve out for himself. And how much does he sort of lean into being a different kind of Republican versus just attacking Kamala Harris? I think that is one of the big open questions of next week.
Who is J.D. Vance performing for on Tuesday night? Is it all of us, meaning not just the media, but the public writ large, or is it Donald Trump? What do you guys think?
It's a really good question. So in debate prep, I should say the stand-in for Tim Walz is Tom Emmer, who is he's a congressman. He's the House Majority Whip. He was a nominee for Speaker at one point, didn't get it during all that drama, and I do think the risk of having someone like Tom Emmer, who knows Walz well — Tom Emmer actually ran for governor and lost in 2010 — is that he plays Walz as sort of a cartoonish, bumbling figure. And in 1996, Jack Kemp was the VP nominee to Bob Dole, and the guy who was the stand-in for Al Gore was, I think, Bob Dornan, a very right-wing conservative congressman who played Gore as this left-wing lunatic. And so Kemp was expecting Gore to be a crazy lefty in the debate, and then Gore was this sort of centrist, pragmatist, moderate. And Kemp was sort of thrown off because he had prepped against this caricature. And I think that there is some risk that in prep, Emmer is playing goofy liberal Walz, and that gives Vance a false idea of what to expect. But I do think that ultimately in debate prep, they're it can't be far from their mind. They are performing for Trump. And remember, the only time Vance came up in the presidential debate, it was when Trump like threw Vance under the bus and was asked about something Vance and said like, JD and I didn't talk about that. Like JD can't speak for me. And so, that's always like, you never like, so clearly Vance is like, he does, it's not a constituency of one because they're trying to win an election, but like that has to be top of mind.
Well, I will say one thing we haven't talked about yet is, is this the last debate? I mean, we talked about it a little bit of like, this might be the last kind of big eyeball event, but there is this concept of, does Trump want Vance, especially if he doesn't have a good night, to have the last word, quote unquote, in a debate right down the stretch? And so I do think there is a scenario where, especially if Vance, because Harris has sort of suggested that she's open to debating more and Trump's the one right now closing the door on that. If Vance especially has a bad night, then maybe that brings Trump to the table again and they set up another debate between Harris and Trump.
I wonder if you deviate from the Trump playbook, but think like, he'll thank me later. Like when we win this thing, he'll thank me later. I mean, it's sort of the instant
I don't think that's worked for many people who've worked in the Trump administration.
Great point, Rhonda,
to deviate.
yes.
So I do, to your question, I do think it is very top of mind for Vance to make sure that he stays or appears to be loyal to Trump, because Trump will obviously be watching this. I've also, this is kind of a side note, I've also been very interested in just the dynamic between the two of them. You can see Vance as a vice presidential nominee who is also very ambitious for himself. So he's not likely going to be, he may not serve the same role as a Pence, who every time Pence was questioned about something Trump did, he tried to put it to bed and say, oh, no, it's not like that. He was always that cheerleader until January 6th, always that cheerleader for Trump. I think Vance also has kind of made moves that seem like he is very aware that he wants a career after this. I was even thinking back to last week when he made comments about unveiling a healthcare plan to overhaul the ACA. Usually you don't hear a vice presidential pick discuss policy plans that directly, and that stood out to me. So I think he's going to try to be on a tightrope of don't upset the main guy, the boss, but also I've got to do this for myself.
It's a really good point. It's interesting because with Walz, like I think one of the things that did help Walz in the Veep stakes was that he was not threatening to Kamala Harris, because I think like Josh Shapiro, clearly ambitious, young, and like Harris is sort of like, this is a guy I could end up running against in a future Democratic primary. And I think Walz, everyone, at that level, like looks in the mirror and sees a future president, but Walz doesn't seem like
again, everyone at that level looks in the mirror.
Every senator, isn't that the same?
They see the president. Okay, right.
They see,
so,
they're like, I don't think Tim Walz is like, my life dream is to be vice president. Like that's not, but I think like he doesn't seem like he's in it for himself. He seems like he's in it for Kamala Harris, and like he's good at.
That's the pitch he made, right?
Exactly,
Pitch he made.
And it worked with her, and I think it will like sort of work in a debate setting, because he's not. I mean, I think he'll tout everything he did in Minnesota and with that Democratic majority that you talked about, but it's not going to seem like Tim Walz is laying the foundation to run for president in 2028 if Harris loses.
When you look in the mirror, what do you guys see, Editor-in-Chief? I just see a tired human looking back at me.
That's a great answer.
That's a kind of ambition I just cannot even relate to at all. As we prepare to head into the next segment, we're going to talk about gender and how the gender gap is playing out in so many fascinating ways right now. I want to play one more Tim Walz clip to round it out, 2 and 2 here. This is in 2022, and he was running for re-election for governor. So we saw a clip of Tim Walz earlier running for House. Now he's running for governor against Republican Scott Jensen. Let's listen.
I trust women. I have my entire life to make their own healthcare decisions. It's dangerous and reckless. It's between them and their healthcare provider. Scott either in May blatantly lied to his supporters to get the endorsement of the Republican Party by saying, of course, we're going to ban abortion, or he's flipped on it now. But the fact of the matter is, this is the most anti-choice, anti-woman ticket that's ever run. His running mate claims that this culture and how women dress and women being out there are part of this abortion issue. This has nothing to do with the governor. As long as I'm governor, women's health care rights are protected.
Tim Walz running for re-election as governor in 2022. Set the timeline and stage for us for that, JM.
So that was just a few months after the Dobbs ruling, right, and kicked abortion back, and start seeing states implement abortion restrictions at that point, right? I think that's notable because it's almost certainly going to come up on Tuesday night, right? This is one of the central issues of this election. And again, the way that Democrats have been able to frame, especially reproductive health and rights in sort of a freedom framing, I think is a winning framing for Democrats. And I would expect Walz to say something. I mean, we've had a couple now where it's like we could easily say them saying something verbatim on Tuesday night. And I think that's the same case with Walz right there.
All right, stay with us. Coming up next, we'll talk more about gender and how it's playing into the campaign. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. We'll be right back. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm with Rhonda, Colvin, James Hohmann, and JM Rieger. Let's talk about the gender gap in how Americans are feeling about the Republican top of the ticket versus the Democratic top of the ticket, James.
So there is a Quinnipiac poll that just came out. Rhonda mentioned it earlier. The race is tied, basically. Trump 48, Harris 47. Among women, Harris leads by 12, 53% to 41%. Now, among men, Trump actually leads by 14, 54% to 40%. This is a historic gender gap. It's even bigger among Gen Z.
That is fascinating.
It's really fascinating. A poll that was released on Tuesday from the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School shows young voters overwhelmingly support Harris. Among likely voters, she's leading, this is people under 30 and under, she's leading 61 to 30, so 2-to-1 lead. Among males, Harris is leading 53-36, but among females, and this number is mind-blowing, among female likely voters 30 and under, Harris has 70% support, while Trump has 23% support. So I mean, these and part of it's the abortion issue, but it's much more than that, and it's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, it's a cultural issue,
especially when you have a tied race at the top of the ticket, and just and the breakdowns are really startling. Even when you the gender does kind of trump, for lack of a better word, a lot of other divisions in the populace.
Well, Rhonda, abortion was always going to be a big issue after the Dobbs decision. So how do you see the candidates messaging on that, and how is it going?
Well, I think ever since the Dobbs decision, Democrats have been messaging hard. They see it working among voters, specifically independent and younger voters, as James just pointed out. It's been working. It's been amazing even to watch this as a reporter, to see the endurance of the Dobbs decision from the minute it happened to today and how it's still mobilizing people. I would add to that, and I know we said this off camera earlier, that I said I wasn't all that surprised with some of the data coming out with the gender gap. Specifically, that's because Biden also, back in January, this was also Quinnipiac, had a poll, and they started seeing that gender gap starting to widen. And it was remarkable then. This was during the time, early primary season. And it was when it really felt real that Biden and Trump would be the nominees for their party. And you started to see more women go behind Biden. So I guess in essence, you can say Harris inherited that, but she's also been able to grow that a little bit more as things get closer and closer to the election.
And she, one of her successes as VP was taking on that messaging, right, about reproductive health, and she really grew into that after the Dobbs decision. Yeah, well, before she knew she would be the nominee, that was a part of her portfolio. It was traveling the country. I believe she was the first executive level person to visit an abortion clinic.
Fun fact, with Tim Walz. She went to she visited a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic in Minnesota with Tim Walz.
Wow, they had a crystal ball. But yeah, this was already in her portfolio.
I mean, because she was sort of struggling to find some strong messaging points, and then it's like that. It's like she found her home there and was able to run.
Exactly. She held calls at the White House. Groups came to talk about the future after Dobbs. So yeah, she really took the issue and ran with it, and it probably is working for her.
And it also plays into this idea of freedom, which Democrats are trying to, as we talked about earlier, are trying to sort of claim as a mantle. So Rhonda, talk to us about the Republicans and how they're dealing with this question of should Trump be taking a massive victory lap because he was able to get Roe v. Wade overturned by getting these conservative justices on the Supreme Court? Like, is that the messaging we're getting from him?
We've heard that message, but it depends what audience he's in front of, because we've heard that, and then we've also heard him, earlier this week saying he will be the protector of women. You won't have to worry about this issue any longer. I'm here.
Let's listen to that tape.
You will be protected, and I will be your protector. Women
Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion. So all they talk about, abortion.
Donald Trump, I actually think that messaging is designed more for men.
Were there a lot of women in the back?
There were some women. There were some women in there. There were a handful. There were a handful. I mean, I think that's designed to reassure men. If the women they live with or know are giving them a hard time about voting for Trump, it's like reassuring them of like, don't worry, it'll be okay. Yeah. But the idea of not having to worry about abortion anymore, it's like a magic. It's like, no, it reminds me of like, don't worry about COVID. It'll be gone, right? Like it'll be gone by the spring. It's the same. He uses the same strategy, right, throughout his like decades in public life, in a sense, right? It's a counterpunch, and it's if someone comes at him, he's deflecting, right? And on this abortion issue, we've talked ad nauseum about how the Trump campaign has not really landed on a solid message on abortion, on reproductive health. It's a winning issue for Democrats, and the Trump campaign knows it cost Republicans in 2022 in some of those key seats, right? There was no red wave in a sense, and that was part of the reason why. I do think that it's interesting that both there and the other week when Trump was talking about childcare, both of those he tries to pivot back to the economy, right, which he knows is his best issue, but he also is losing ground to Harris on. And he's trying to essentially pivot away from reproductive health in a sense, and just say your economic fortunes will be so good it will kind of wash away all these other concerns that you have, which I think is an interesting message. I'm not sure if it's a winning one.
I just think it's incredibly weird in a free society for a politician in either party, put aside the gender part of it, just to be talking that way. Like, it's not a king or it's an elected leader. The president is supposed to be like of the citizenry, not above the citizenry. It's also not a parent. It's not a parent. It's like there's something parental and kind of controlling. It is totally out of the Trump playbook, and it is, I think, very like strongman sort of language. But there's something that feels deeply un-American about the framing and the tone and the way he's talking about his fellow Americans.
Yeah, it seems a little out of touch in a way that you could see why younger voters, with polling that you discuss, might not, be. That message may not be appealing. It does seem very, even saying I'll be your protector, that generationally may not work with some younger voters. But, the gender gap issue is really important. One reason is because women usually outvote men in elections and presidential elections. I was actually reading something from the Center of American Women in Politics that's run out of Rutgers. Women have outvoted and outregistered to vote in every presidential election since 1980, and every presidential election since then, that gap keeps widening. So women certainly turn out. Even think about the day after Trump was inaugurated the first time, the Women's March. I still think that broke records that still stand today of how many people turned out. So it is kind of mystifying that the Republicans or Trump himself, that they're not finding a way to really appeal.
I want to pivot to the fact that we almost ignore in some funny ways that Harris could be the first woman president. It's just not something that she's doubling down on. And even at the DNC, we heard her supporters say, the next president, not the first this, the first that. And so that's even messaging they're doing internally, which is different than how the team around Hillary Clinton was really painting her, that sort of joyful, like we're breaking this glass ceiling open. But it's fascinating to think if that's mattering at all. Like, is it mattering to women and female and male voters as they take into account who and what she is? I want to move on, though, to two things. Mark Robinson, gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina, also currently serves in the administration there, is having this huge scandal. Someone just give us like the quick. James, you're really good at like the fast drive-by. Give us the drive-by.
Well, what did he say exactly?
Yeah. James literally ticked me off today because I'm making him do this. No, I'm so.
Someone just cuts the tape of me. I'm not going to like read his posts.
No, it's so offensive. The reason why it's just so offensive.
And even, I'm sure people watching know. So Mark Robinson wrote, even before these latest revelations, he's said a lot of wild stuff, but he basically wrote comments on pornographic websites that were really, really raunchy And,
like offensive in terms of race, gender, all of it. And this is something that was unveiled by CNN. He is saying they're not his posts. A lot of Republicans are distancing themselves from him right now. This is so important, though, because North Carolina could be a really vital state here, Rhonda.
Yeah, it's becoming one of those states that we're really watching closely, and it could, make a decision for, the presidency or who wins it that night. So I think the remaining question, because Robinson said, like you said, these aren't his comments and that he's staying in it, but he has had staffers quit after this.
Both from his campaign and from his lieutenant governor office. So
it feels like
lonely.
His campaign may be on its last legs. We don't know, of course. Election day hasn't happened, but it is going to be interesting to see how this affects Trump. We'll see on election night.
And can Democrats saddle Trump with him, not just in North Carolina, but in other places as well?
And talking about Vance, this may actually come up at the debate because Vance has said that these allegations may not be based in reality, I believe was the quote.
He had a very funny double negative. He said, I don't not believe that these are his posts. It was something where he was very uncomfortable and he's sort of like that. And then I think he said it's between the candidate and the people of North Carolina.
It's like, how much do you not say about this? So it may come up. I don't know. But it has been an interesting development in a very important state.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to mention is how Donald Trump is being painted in his relationship with women. We talked about how he's talking about women on the campaign trail. Melania Trump just gave an interview to Fox News. She has a book coming out, which is an incentive for her to go out and do interviews. We did see a lot of women related to Trump world at the convention, but it was a lot more in like a business context. Mm-hmm. And even though we did see a granddaughter, we're just not seeing Melania out there. And wives are often playing the role, spouses in general, of showing that personal nature of someone. Not in this case. George Conway, who is super anti-Trump, ex-husband of Kellyanne Conway, of course, has worked for Trump, has a PAC, and he's putting out ads that are showing accusations that women have against Donald Trump for sexual assault. The name of George Conway's PAC is the Anti-Psychopathic PAC, Inc. And what that means is that at the end of the ads, it says this advertisement was brought to you by the Anti-Psychopathic. But I mean, it's like next level thinking about how you're branding the person you're trying to hit, in this case, Donald Trump. So I want to just talk about them briefly because these ads are going to air on some of Trump's favorite TV networks like Fox News, ESPN, and the Golf Channel. They're going to air where he lives, and they're also going to air on Newsmax during the VP debate on Tuesday night. Let's play a snippet from one of them. It features Natasha Stoynoff, who wrote a profile of Trump and Melania for People magazine. This was back in 2006 when Melania was pregnant. So if you're watching with us on YouTube, you'll see this ad that Conway's PAC has put out. If you're listening, you'll still get the sense of it, but picture the images from People magazine that include a smiling Donald Trump and a pregnant, smiling Melania Trump.
My name is Natasha Stoynoff. In 2005, I went to interview Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. At one point, Melania went upstairs to change her clothes for the next photo shoot. And Trump said to me, I want to show you this beautiful painting, this beautiful room. He leads me to this room, pushes me against the wall, and starts kissing me forcefully. I tried to push him. He kept coming back at me. I was in shock and smothered, and he had his hands here against my shoulders. I felt sick inside. I felt horrified.
The ad goes on from there, and it's one of a couple that Conway's PAC has released so far. Just to give you some of the reporting context for this, Stoynoff came out with her story about Trump back in 2016, 10 years after this happened. But the context is important because the Access Hollywood tape had come out and that story broken by the Washington Post. Then Trump did a debate where he said, I've not groped women. And after that, she, as well as a handful of other women, came out and said, actually, that happened to me. And so the Post has reported on her story before on these allegations, which Trump totally denies. But these ads are designed to do what, James?
Get under his skin, get him saying wild and outrageous stuff, get him, I think in George Conway's perfect world, truthing during the VP debate about the anti-psychopath PAC and distracting from potentially a good debate by J.D. Vance. And it really is about getting in Trump's head. And he also, I mean, since 2016, when all those women came forward in the E. Jean Carroll case, he was found liable for defaming her by saying that he did not sexually assault her.
And he was found guilty of sexually assaulting her.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we
In a
also
civil suit.
And we also
In a civil suit. Thank you.
we know that Trump sees these ads, not necessarily this one, we don't know yet, but we know he's seen ads because as president, he would tweet about stuff. There was a period where ads were being aired on Fox News and the Washington, D.C. market, and he was seeing it in the White House and tweeting about it at the time. And even at a rally this week, he was talking, he went on a riff on one of his tangents about Fox News hosts and the coverage of Fox. And then at one point he goes, but then they'll say so many nice things and then I'll see all these things that are negative about me. And he didn't really explain what that was, whether that was another person on Fox saying something negative or whether it was an ad. But he is someone who's like so engrossed in television, right? And even the Golf Channel, I think, is so interesting because we know he is at his golf clubs all the time, right? And what is usually on in the clubhouse at a golf club is the Golf Channel, right? So there's a decent chance that he is going to see these ads.
So, Rhonda, as we think about all of this in summation, what takeaways do you have about this question of the gender gap in supporting these candidates? Like, what are you going to be watching for in the next couple of weeks to see if it changes or what a huge effect it might have?
Yeah, I'm really interested to see if it widens any further. Again, going over the statistics that I shared, that women usually outvote men. That's pretty important in a race that will be down to, thousands of votes in some of these battleground states. So we'll see if it widens. We'll see if Republicans, I'm also interested to see if Trump or other Republicans try to shore up some of this messaging problem that they have with women. But again, we should also point out that there are many women who are very much for the former president, who will campaign for him. So again, this nothing is certain yet, but it does appear that because of Dobbs and also possibly because Harris is a fresh face in all of this, she is appealing to women voters right now.
JM, you're going to be in New York next week, guiding us through the vice presidential debate, and everyone can see you on Tuesday night. So tell us the details.
CBS News is hosting it. It's at 9 p.m., runs 9 to 10:30, so same amount of time as the ABC debate between Harris and Trump a few weeks back. And, I think this will be an interesting debate. And I do want to see how they define each other, how they try to define each other, and how they get at really kind of the top line issues, which I do think are in no particular order, but economy, immigration, and reproductive health. I think those are issues that they can draw a line in the sand. This is really shaping up to be a base election. So how they play to that will be interesting.
Tune in to the Washington Post for live coverage starting at 8 o'clock Eastern time. You can catch our coverage on our YouTube channel. Look for the Washington Post or on our homepage, WashingtonPost.com. We'll also have a lot of print journalists documenting what's happening throughout the night. And you can join James, Rhonda, JM, and the rest of our team as we do a preview starting at 8, and then we'll stick around afterwards to debrief, and we'll see if it is anything as impactful as the other two debates of this cycle, the presidential debates. I'm just can't wait to watch with all of you. So we'll see you potentially Tuesday night, and then we'll also see you next Thursday with the next episode of Sidebar on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. I'm Libby Casey. See you soon.